Welcome back to the sixth video in the Wise Words series. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. I really appreciate that investment, and I would love to hear your thoughts as we dig in and continue thinking about it. So over the last few videos, I keep promising that I am going to address this idea of wise listening and discernment, because we've been talking about how we speak needs to come after we have first listened. So what does that look like? And while James doesn't get there himself and focus on this idea of discernment and discerning listening, the book of Proverbs does. Proverbs often breaks things into what scholars will describe as the two ways. There's the wise way and the foolish way. And we see that also with the idea of speech. But one of the things that's really interesting, and we especially see this in Proverbs 10 to 29, is this idea that speech has a fundamental social impact. One of the comments, I read an article recently by Wendy Witter, and one of the comments that she makes is that Proverbs nuances the power of speech by drawing attention to the consequences of words on others. There's fundamentally an aspect, a direct effect of individual speech on the well-being of society, of our communities. And so what Proverbs does in chapters 10 to 29 is really teases some of that out. So we can think about this, and we'll start digging into this idea more later. We can think about this in the way that we speak, but as we are listening, what is the effect of that speech? If speech is fundamentally something that builds into the community, is this speech that is building the community or tearing it apart? So how does Proverbs talk about foolish speech versus wise speech? And Witter in this article gave a summary. And one of these days I want to go back and do my own thorough analysis. I have not done that. I wanted to go ahead and record this, but she gives a number of different characteristics and verses related to them. She talks about foolish speech, and she always lists verses, but it breaks the spirit. It betrays secrets. It slanders. Foolish speech can be giving false testimony. It can ruin a city. It entices to destruction. It divides friends, and it creates anger and contention. What are the voices we are hearing around us? Wise speech contrasts with that. And what you can find as you look at many verses, and I'll give you two examples in just a minute, in Proverbs, is that these are direct opposites. In one line, you'll have a description of foolish speech, and a line of wise speech. And there's a contrast there, and they're usually related. So some of the things that wise words do, and that as we're listening, we can ask, what's the impact on the audience? Wise speech heals, it refreshes, it brings life. It can save lives. It specifically is getting at the idea of truthful witnesses there. So that would contrast with giving false testimony. It shares knowledge. It honors others, and it brings gladness. It corrects appropriately. So this is not to say that we never listen to speech that can correct us, that it might be a hard truth. So this isn't saying that foolish speech is speech that says something we don't like. We actually may need to hear that. It could bring correction. But is the fruit of that going to be restoration? Is it going to be healing? Is it going to be life? Is it going to be all those things, not just for me, but for my community? Wise speech corrects appropriately, and the way it is done also matters. Wise speech will counsel well, and of course, it diffuses anger, and it diffuses conflict. And I want to focus on those last two ideas in two verses out of Proverbs chapter 15. First one I'm going to read is from verse 18, and the second one is from verse 1. A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. There is a time and place for appropriate anger. But far too often I feel like we're looking around each other and so many of us are angry, and I've been guilty of that. I've found myself going on Twitter or X and scrolling, and when I got off, so often I would be angry. I was angry at injustices I was seeing. I was angry at the way that people were addressing things. And there are injustices that we need to speak to, and this gets back to the idea of correcting appropriately, right? But, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. But the tone and the way in which things are said matters. Is it spoken with patience, as this verse in 18 says, in 15:18? But the one who is patient calms a quarrel. Is it expressed patiently? A gentle word turns away wrath. Is it spoken gently? Is there concern for the well-being of the other? And so as I was listening, I was finding that I was feeding anger. And so for me, and this is where I think we start seeing the first step of discernment. Is what we're listening to inviting us to fruit that builds community? Is it demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit? It's interesting because both of those verses, the idea of a patient person speaking and a gentle word, patience and gentleness are part of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. I'm not saying that we turn everybody off and never listen to people that we disagree with. I actually come from a very interesting background. Right now, I live in a very blue county of a very red state. In the past, I've lived in red counties in very blue states. So I've kind of spread that out. I come from the world of finance, but I've did a PhD in what would be considered the liberal arts in Canada. Okay? Very different perspectives on things. Theologically, so that's kind of on the political side of things, or getting at it, different ways of seeing the world, prioritizing different things. But then I've also got a theological different approach. Or not approach, but theologically broad. My mother grew up Methodist. My father grew up Southern Baptist. I've attended both churches. I've attended non-denominational churches, Presbyterian churches, evangelical free churches. I went to Catholic school and Episcopalian school, and I've had some really interesting conversations with friends who are both Orthodox and Anglican. Okay, so I've had this wide exposure. And you know what I've found? I found that a lot of these people, because you can sit in certain contexts and it's like, they don't have their theology right. They're wrong. They must not be real Christians. Not everybody, but I often run across this attitude. But what I've found is that a lot of people, they've come to a different understanding. And I see the fruit of the Spirit in their lives, and they love Jesus, and they're trying to figure out the best and most faithful way to follow him. But I only learned that because I could stop and listen. But I listened with discernment. Am I seeing that fruit of the Spirit? And as I do, allowing those people and those communities to speak into my own life and to build. So that comes to our first step of discernment that I've really already gotten at. What effect are the voices that we're listening to having on us? Are they creating anger? Are they dividing friends? Or are they bringing healing, promoting life, bringing restoration, and diffusing the anger and the contention? How about when you listen to your favorite politician or your favorite preacher? I mean, let's look at it. It's in the church too. It's not just in our politics. It's in the church. Are we being instruments? Are we feeding the problem by listening to these voices that are not demonstrating the fruit? But I guess here's something that, and I don't know quite how to express this well, because I think we need to listen to those voices so that we can understand them, but then recognize the fruit or lack thereof. That's where the piece of discernment comes in. So I'm not saying just shut off everything and never listen to somebody else. I'm not saying that at all, but we do need to consider the impact that those words are having on us personally and on our communities, and consider whether those are the kinds of words and ideas that we want to encourage and promote as we start. Because remember, we absorb, we listen, and then eventually we will turn to our own speech. What do we want to incorporate in our own speech from what we're hearing, and what do we not? Because this idea of listening and then speaking, they're overlapping, right? So all these ideas about words, we'll come back to this later, but all this that we're hearing and absorbing, how do we want to incorporate it into our own thinking? And the challenge is that a lot of these things, they hit us at a subconscious level. So is the speech we're listening into tapping into anger? Is it tapping into our fear? Or is it building up love of God and love of neighbor? Is it seeking reconciliation and restoration and healing and life? Or is it bringing something else? So just some thoughts. I would love to hear practical ideas that you have, your own experiences. Have you run into cases where, like my Twitter story, have you run into some things that you found to be helpful? Like for me, it's been stepping back. I'm not totally off Twitter, but I'm sorry, I can't get used to calling it X. I'm not totally off of X, but I have stepped way back in how much I'm engaging. And you know what? I'm not just not listening. I'm actually taking time, a lot of that time I would spend, and I'm reading extended essays on Substack, for example, where someone takes the time to thoughtfully expand their ideas, and I can help me understand their thinking so that I can understand this different point of view better. Or I'm investing it in people in my community, listening to friends and people at church, learning how I can pray for them, come alongside them and help them. So what are some of the things that we can learn? So those are some of the things that I'm doing. I'm stepping back, not entirely from social media, but from some of my social media. And I'm trying to reinvest that time in ways that I believe are going to build my knowledge, my foundation, still listening, but also build the community around me. What are your thoughts? What are some ways that you found listening to be powerful, or that what are some lessons you think we can learn? I'd love to hear your thoughts.